So my name is Edzia Carvalho. As Anshula said, I'm a lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Dundee. And I'm joined by Lily Meller, who was an alumna of a module that I run at the university. And this is what we are going to be talking about. So we are co-authoring this paper with about uh, four other four other alumni from the module who are not present here at the moment. Lily is very kindly offered to co-present with me and share our joint experiences on the module. So the the focus of the paper really is to try and understand what is it to teach human rights in a university context, um, and in particular to teach human rights activism in a university context. So um, there is, you probably are quite familiar with student activists, including human rights activists who are students as well. And you're probably also familiar with human rights education in a university context, but without the application of student activism included in it. And so we start our presentation by summarizing the differences between these two elements. So we are talking about, when we talk about human rights student activism, we're talking about students going out into the world and applying the knowledge that they have obtained either as part of their studies or just their general interest in the world, and channeling their knowledge, channeling their passion into trying to get a change in some kind of policy or in some kind of practice that they care about. A lot of these students will then have very strong in-group identification because they are all bound by the cause that they are advocating for. And these often tend to be flat structures, so they're not very hierarchical. But because of the real world implications of what the students are doing, they have a very high exposure to risk. For example, being arrested at a protest. Um, but the focus of their work is very instrumental, is very much trying to obtain a goal for which they are advocating, for which they are working towards. In the university context, when we talk about teaching human rights, without this element of student activism, human rights modules tend to look very much like other modules that are taught in this context, with the difference being the content. So the focus of the module is very much human rights, either philosophy or law or human rights policy. But the modules are run in very similar ways to other modules that are run in a different discipline, let's say, even. So the focus is very much on recall or on analysis of concepts. There are no real external avenues for the students on the module to apply what they have learned. There is very low in-group identification between the students, other than the fact that they probably recognize that they are all interested in human rights, but there's nothing else binding them, bringing them together. There's a very strong hierarchical structure in the module. The module lecturer is the authority, whereas the students obviously have to address that authority in different ways. There is no exposure to risk, almost no exposure to risk at all. And the instrumental focus of the module is to complete assessments. Um, so, what does it really mean to have human rights education in this kind of context? And Anya Mihr suggests that human rights education should be a little bit more than just another module. And so she talks about human rights education focusing on knowledge, on the development of understanding, both intellectual understanding and emotional understanding, and learning about action. So, learning for human rights. So, taking everything that they have done, what students have done on a module, and then applying it somewhere so that there is some kind of an outcome. And so, following on from this, um, we want to talk about this module that I run at the University of Dundee, which combines human rights study with student activism. And we are trying to understand how can human rights advocacy be taught and what are the benefits and challenges of learning through and learning for human rights. Learning, developing this understanding of human rights and then applying that understanding. Um, so this module is run at the undergraduate and the taught postgraduate level. It's an internship that is run in collaboration with a New York-based NGO called Scholars at Risk. And Scholars at Risk advocates for academics and students who are in prison and as part of their Scholars in Prison project. So in the module, I train the students to design, run, and evaluate an advocacy campaign. So their advocacy campaign for one of the imprisoned scholars. Um, the students run a whole range of campaigns, as I'll show on the next slide. And we have a presence on social media. And in order to do this, they network with Scholars at Risk, but also with other student campaigns that are run under the aegis of Scholars at Risk. So I've been running this module since 2016. And on average, we've had about 3 student advocacy campaigns that have run every year, and an average of 15 students every year who have been trained in advocacy skills. The students have been incredibly giving of their time and effort to advocate for these imprisoned academics and students. They've raised a lot of awareness about these cases over the years. And they've had quite significant successes as well, including early day motions in Parliament by our local MP, letters written to the UK Foreign Secretary about the academics that they have been advocating for, and so on. But a big portion of this impact is often unmeasured, as Lily will speak about later, both on the students and on the people that are being advocated for. And this is about the connection of solidarity and the feeling that there are people across the world, strangers who have never met the person in prison and probably never will, but who care about what's happening about this person in prison and are willing to go to a few lengths to make that known. What are my experiences on the module? So I've seen both opportunities and challenges. The opportunity has been to contribute to the development of a human rights community on campus, to train the next generation of advocates, and also to contribute to Scholars at Risk's ongoing work. But more importantly, it's a sense of fulfillment. So I joke that I wanted to be a human rights advocate, but instead became a lecturer. And so this is a backdoor route into advocacy for me. But the challenges have been also quite significant and quite a huge learning experience for me as well. Increasingly on campus, we have faced freedom of speech issues, and they have also turned up in the module. So it's been quite interesting for me to deal with those issues and to work out what is my duty of care towards the students, where does that end or start, and to what extent do I give the students freedom to develop their own campaigns without really interfering in that. There's been a little bit of student disappointment, some hostility, some disengagement, partly arising from their fear about how they are going to be assessed and how the success of the campaign is going to feed into their assessments. The module doesn't fit into the university's type, the regular type of module. And so I've come up against a bit of university bureaucracy in terms of working out how to deliver this module in a way that's good for the students. And then there's also the issue about unpaid and unacknowledged staff time, because a module like this goes above and beyond what a normal module would require. Right, I'm going to pass on to Lily, who will take us through the rest of the presentation, and starting with the experiences of her and her colleagues.
Thank you very much, Etzia. I will also start with our experience as students. And even though we did a module during different years and also used different advocacy strategies, we shared many of our experiences. So my group decided to do a campaign focusing on social media platforms, so on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and on posters on the university campus. And we used engaging elements and our knowledge about deep psychology of attention and compassion to educate students. We accompanied this with presentations during the lectures of other students in cooperation with the lecturers. And even though other groups did different campaigns, our experiences were similar. You can read some of them on the slides right now. So for me, I learned skills like professional communication and violent-free communication during disagreements, and also how to channel the spark for something that's important into action. And those skills are useful now as an alumna working on my first professional roles and in private political and societal discussions. You can see that similar experiences have been made by Hedda, Maya, and Victoria. Hedda, Maya, and Victoria did a module together last year. And of course, everyone still had individual takeaways and is and will be growing differently from this experience. So for example, Lewis is a good example for that because he is the only student in the group of students who are working on this paper now who did the module as an online module during the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can read his experiences here, and I will touch on the impact that this change had on using human rights activism as a pedagogic tool in a couple of minutes. So altogether, those experiences lead to the main difference between human rights activism and human rights education that we already talked about. The impact of human rights education is easier to measure, for example, through exams, essays, and testing knowledge of the literature, and the risk for students is, of course, smaller. But the impact is as well in comparison to human rights activism, but also in comparison to human rights education that includes student activism. And that is pretty much the thing that makes education that includes student activism special. It teaches transferable skills and gives individuals chances to develop these skills and oneself, all while giving guidance and structure and taking away some of the risks of human rights education or human rights activism outside of education. And one of the best examples of this slow but meaningful growth is that us students are, or like as us alumni are now working on a paper about this topic together. This shows that not all learned skills and development can be captured in grades and exams, and that growth and learning can be slow but prolonged. So this is the conclusion from the lens of us university students. The question remains, though, whether this should be the most important influence on how pedagogy should be adopted for human rights education in the university setting. Because of that, we now want to take a look at different approaches to human rights pedagogy and student activism in university settings, starting with human rights pedagogy. So Anja Mihr, that you heard about before, makes the point that formalized human rights education, like in a university module, is important because it reaches people who would not seek out private human rights education themselves. Of course, as students could have decided to take another module, but we were at least introduced to a readily available option. Formalized does not necessarily mean traditional or passive, though, which is why Paulo Freire poses a problem-posing education. That is basically the name. In this form of education, all participants are students and teachers simultaneously, which basically means that this classical teacher-centered education gets exchanged for a more interactive one. That is important because as students bring past experiences, emotion, ideas, and values into the classroom, they have to be the starting point of learning about, through, and for human rights. Charles Bonello and Paul Pace describe this as transformative pedagogy, which is composed of constructivistic ideas and critical pedagogy. So constructivistic ideas or constructivism proposes basically that knowledge is not objective and discovered or taught, but instead constructed. That also means that students cannot be passive acceptors of teachers' knowledge, but develop these ideas together with teachers through reflecting on their beliefs, values, and past knowledge. And critical pedagogy is then the critical analyzation of this knowledge from the perspective of social justice and diversity. This is done through reflection, through dialogue and action, to become aware of the challenges and opportunities of questioning and changing dominant structures. The thing is, this only works if the classroom itself becomes a safe and engaging space in which everyone feels comfortable enough and encouraged to voice their experiences and opinions. This includes the possibility to safely disagree and constructively criticize the opinions of other students and also the teachers without facing negative consequences. To achieve this, students need to feel a sense of community. Being physically together, of course, does not guarantee that, but it does make it easier, which is where we're talking about Louis' experience during the COVID-19 pandemic again. So this is basically why switching to online learning especially impacts those engaging and communicative forms of education that basically live from the sense of community and feeling safe and comfortable enough with your peers to talk about your experiences and opinions. To summarize this, effective human rights pedagogy basically needs two things. That is, an engaging, safe environment and a constructivistic and critical approach to learning. The thing is, implementing these would benefit both human rights education that does and that does not include student activism. And I would argue it could probably benefit education in many other fields as well. So that means while this is a necessary condition for human rights education that includes student activism, it is not an efficient one. So let's take a look on what it needs for student activism as pedagogy to be successful. And for that, we have to look at the challenges that student activism as pedagogy faces. First, there are budget and time constraints. Ezio already talked about those for a while. So while professional activists and even some student activist groups normally have access to some kind of funding, we could only use the money that was raised during the course of the human rights campaign itself, which in our case meant less than one semester. That's where the time constraints come in. This makes it significantly harder to host events, invite speakers, or even print some posters and have access to subscription-based online tools. And this ties back basically into the second point, which is grading. So our campaign couldn't be longer than one semester because we needed to get a grade for the module at the end. That makes having enough time to do an impacting campaign harder. And also the grading itself is a potential struggle due to the module ideally having a discussive nature without clear right or wrong answers. And because of that, Mihr proposes to focus on grading things like solidarity, self-reflection, and self-criticism, as well as solution orientation and empathy. Our grading was therefore done through a strategy document for a campaign and then a reflective essay, which, in my opinion, were good ways of grading in a module like this, where you can't really grade a right or wrong answer. The third challenge is again tied to the structure of university, since university studies are nearly always separated by subject. And because of that, firstly, not all students get access to human rights pedagogy in their degree at all. And secondly, if students have access to it, their voice is missing. So this hinders an interdisciplinary human rights pedagogy. Our campaigns, this is just a few examples, could have potentially greatly benefited from having biologists, lawyers, gender studies students, etc., in our groups. And those students would have benefited as well from being able to use their knowledge for human rights. The fourth challenge is adjacent to this problem, and it is the potential of exclusive human rights pedagogy, where groups get empowered in their own rights or discuss the rights of one specific marginalized group. And through this, there's a danger of disregarding or even discriminating against the rights of others and other marginalized groups that are just not discussed. To combat this, it is important to not exclude specific groups. This can be a problem outside of university education, of course. Us being students and then advocating for academics through Scholars at Risk means that we are definitely prone to accidentally doing exclusive human rights education by focusing on academics. We try to combat that through talking about different aspects of the circumstances of the academics we were advocating for, like focusing on women rights, on animal rights, criticizing of death row, or the importance of independent research. For that, we try to not exclude non-academic groups while still focusing on a specific issue. Through whether this is something we are fully able to do or we were fully able to do is something that we're still in the process of exploring, and something that honestly probably time will tell. All of those issues, could you go back one slide again, please, Etzia, just for a second? Now, because all of those issues lead to the quote that you can read on the slides down. It is important that human rights pedagogy aims to take place in real life, even in a university module. That means it interacts with real human rights issues, real organizations trying to combat those, and in hierarchy-free communications with a wide variety of people. Thank you so much, Etzia. One solution for this is well-done student activism, because of the benefits it has, and well-done student activism in the context of human rights education. To do this good student activism in the context of human rights education, though, we need to keep in mind the challenges that arise and that I just talked about, and that exist through the structure of university education. And we need to think about ways we approach teaching and learning in this institution to make sure that human rights activism as education then can be meaningful and can have an impact. I would like to give back to you, Etzia, for just a final conclusion. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lily. So just a quick, because we know we've gone over time, so just a quick summary of what we are going to do next is have a thematic analysis of all our reflections, theorize these themes, and then look at what does this mean for discussion on human rights pedagogy in the context of both the university and activism. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to answering questions.